They say that in the low country of South Carolina, the soil doesn't just grow crops, it keeps receipts. In the humid, salt-thick air of the marshes, there are places where the moonlight seems to turn a bruised shade of purple. During the height of the plantation era, there was a stretch of land known as the Hanging Acre. It was a field that no one, not even the most desperate, would dare to harvest after the sun dipped below the cypress trees. It wasn't because of the rattlesnakes or the rising tide. It was because of the watchers. In February of 1845, a night so cold the Spanish moss froze into jagged icicles, an overseer named Silas Thorne vanished. Thorne was a man who took pleasure in the lash, a man who believed the land belonged to him, and the people on it were merely tools. When the sun rose the next morning, Silas was gone. His horse was found tied to a fence, shivering in terror. The only trace of the man was his wide-brimmed hat, perched atop a new scarecrow in the center of the field. But this wasn't a scarecrow made of straw and old burlap. As the workers approached, the wind died down, and the field went deathly silent. They noticed the fabric of the scarecrow wasn't flickering in the wind, it was twitching. Under the rough twine and the sackcloth, something was pulsing. They heard a sound that would haunt their bloodlines for generations, a muffled, wet, rhythmic wheezing. The scarecrow wasn't stuffed with hay, it was stuffed with a man who was still breathing. But his mouth had been sewn shut with iron thread, and his limbs had been broken and reset to fit the wooden cross frame. The Gullah elders call this the midnight harvest. They believe that when the land has tasted too much innocent blood, it creates its own justice. The soil reaches up and claims the predators, turning them into the very things they use to guard their wealth. These scarecrows are the silent sentinels of the marsh. They are forced to stand in the freezing rain, their eyes stitched shut, watching a world they can no longer touch. If you drive through those backroads today and see a figure in a field that looks a little too heavy, if you notice that its head has turned just an inch to follow the sound of your engine, do not stop. The harvest is an ancient cycle, and the land is always looking for fresh skin to wrap around its wooden bones. In the low country, some screams aren't heard by the ears. They are felt in the roots of the trees. The 1930s in the Mississippi Delta was a time of magic and misery. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the sound of the blues, music that didn't just tell a story, it bled. Musicians would travel from town to town, playing for coins and a glass of gin. But among the legends of Robert Johnson and the Crossroads, there was a whisper of a forbidden melody. They called it the 13th note. It wasn't part of any scale known to man. It was a frequency that existed in the gap between life and whatever comes after. The story centers on a trumpet player named Blind Leroy. Leroy didn't play for the crowds. He played for the shadows. He claimed he learned the 13th note from a figure he met in a graveyard during a lunar eclipse. It said that when a musician hits that specific, jarring, dissonant note, the laws of physics simply stop. The first time Leroy played it in a packed, smoky juke joint in Memphis, the room didn't just go quiet, it went void. The patrons were frozen in mid-laugh, their drinks suspended in the air. But their eyes didn't freeze. They turned a milky, clouded white, rolling back into their heads. Leroy looked around and realized he wasn't looking at his friends anymore. He was looking at the shadow audience. Thousands of figures from every decade, standing shoulder to shoulder in the corners of the room, vibrating with a soundless scream. They were the souls who had heard the note before, trapped in a loop of time, forever waiting for the song to end. The 13th note acts like a hook in the soul. Once you hear it, the world you know begins to thin. You start to see the people around you as they really are, hollow shells waiting to be filled with the dark music. Leroy was eventually found slumped over his horn. His lungs collapsed as if something had sucked the very breath out of his body from the inside. But his trumpet was missing. They say that horn is still out there, passing from pawn shop to pawn shop, waiting for a musician looking for that perfect sound. If you find yourself in a jazz club this month and the music starts to feel wrong, if the brass starts to sound like a human throat tearing itself apart, and you feel a cold, smoky finger brush against the back of your neck, get out. Because once the 13th note is struck, the silence that follows isn't an absence of sound. It's the sound of thousands of ghosts finally finding a new voice to scream through. During the Great Migration, the North was promised as a land of iron and opportunity. Thousands of black families packed their lives into cardboard suitcases and headed for cities like Chicago and Detroit. They built the skyscrapers. They laid the foundations. But some of those foundations were built on more than just stone. In the winter of 1954, during the construction of a massive tenement building on the south side, the silent scream of the city was born. Story goes that a young worker named Elias was tasked with smoothing the concrete in the sub-basement during a midnight shift. A freak accident, or perhaps something more sinister involving the corrupt foreman of the time, led to Elias falling into the deep, wet pour of the foundation. By the time anyone noticed, the concrete had set. The building rose 20 stories into the air, but the soul of the structure stayed in the dark. Residents began to report things that the city inspectors couldn't explain. It started with the dust prints. Every morning, mothers would find gray, cement dust handprints on the foreheads of their sleeping children. Then came the thudding. Not the clanking of pipes, but a dull, heavy, rhythmic thud, 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 coming from inside the solid basement walls. It sounded like a man hitting a drum made of bone. But it wasn't a drum. It was Elias, trying to find a way out of the tomb he had been wearing for 40 years. The most terrifying phenomenon was the wall whispers. People claimed that if you pressed your ear against the basement concrete during the coldest week of February, you wouldn't hear a ghost story. You would hear the sound of a man drowning in dry air. A raspy, grinding sound, like gravel moving through a throat. The concrete sentinel doesn't just haunt the building, he protects it. But his protection comes at a price. Every few decades, a crack appears in the basement wall in the shape of a human silhouette. And every time that crack appears, someone in the building goes missing. They say Elias is lonely in the dark, and he's looking for someone to help him hold up the weight of the city. If you live in an old apartment, and you notice a patch of the wall that stays warm even when the heat is off, or if you hear a muffled voice calling your name from behind the plaster, do not answer. Because once you're pulled into the concrete, you don't die. You just become part of the architecture, screaming silently into the stone until the building falls. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.